Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, I am wearing the same shirt as in the last video. Uh, and I want to talk about this game that I had in round 4 of the Midwest Clash Championship between myself and Rohit Guha. So this is the second 16-year-old I've played in the tournament. My other two opponents thus far were 12 years old, so I just realized tournament went 12-year-old, 16-year-old, 12-year-old, 16-year-old. I actually played a 12-year-old in the last round as well. I hate children. Okay, just kidding. So Rohit Guha comes in, decides he's going to play d4 against me. So far, so normal. I go knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and this guy, this child has the audacity to play the f3 Nimzo against me. Does he not know who I am? All right. So I decided to play this line that I have been playing for some time now with castles kingside. And after a3, we get bishop takes c3. You might be wondering why not e4. Turns out this is a line, but it actually tends to favor black a little bit after d5, e5, knight f d7. And okay, I don't want to get bogged down in the details here. Basically, black is going to challenge the center very early on, and white ends up a little bit overextended. So it turns out the better way for white to play is with a3 first. We get captures. Then I play this line involving knight to e8, just because I like putting all the pieces in the back row. I think it's hilarious. Now my opponent can and should expand in the center with e4. I've given up more so on d5 than before. So now I go b6 to develop my pieces. Opponent plays bishop d3. And now, if you're unfamiliar with this line, it might look like black is just getting absolutely smashed. I think I said in my last video, it's okay to give your opponent the center, as long as you challenge it very directly and very, very quickly. This opening may potentially be the exception to that rule. We are going to challenge the center, but we're actually going to focus on this c4 pawn weakness rather than the actual central pawn duo d4 and c4, at least for the moment. Eventually, those center pawns will get their due, but for the moment, black focuses on this specific pawn here on c4. So that is the entire crux of this opening. It's sort of the Nimzo Indian at its purest. We have given up our bishop for the knight, and now we will make use of that pawn weakness in exchange for our dark squared bishop. He will not have died in vain. We will come after this pawn. So that's exactly what I do. I start with knight to c6. My opponent plays e5. I go bishop a6, attacking a guy. My opponent plays knight to h3. And here, I go ahead and play knight to a5, just sticking to the course, right? I'm attacking the c4 pawn, want to take the c4 pawn, I want to go get him. Now, in my head, I actually knew that two moves existed here. I knew that I could go queen h4 check, drawing this knight back to f2, and follow this up with knight to a5. Amongst other things, f6 is also playable. And I also knew that after knight to a5, the main move is queen to e2. Then I can go queen to h4 check, and we'll get the same position. So my mistake was not realizing that there is a difference between these move orders. So if I go knight a5 here, turns out my opponent has an additional option to come knight to g5. So this was something that I was not familiar with, and my opponent managed to surprise me in the opening yet again. It's crazy how often that happens to me against these little children who study all day. Okay, so we've been surprised in the opening. We have to figure out what to do. So first things first, what happens if I take a free pawn? Okay, no points for guessing bishop h7 check, and when we just get shredded, right? Okay, this pawn is important. Now that this pawn is dead, queen h5 is going to happen, and I'm going to lose the game in absolutely horrific manners. So we have a problem. We need to solve the problem. Now, somewhat embarrassingly, I spent quite a lot of time calculating what happens after h6. I mentioned these kinds of embarrassing things because I think it's worth noting. This happens to at least players of my level. You get stuck calculating some line that very, very obviously doesn't work at all, and that's just life. you know, sometimes you just have to accept that your brain isn't working correctly, and you need to go back to square one and start anew. Little backstory to this game. I was operating on 4 hours of sleep on this final day here, so potentially that contributed to these misfirings. So what's the problem with h6? It looks like it's great. If this knight moves away, bam, free pawn, we're crushing. And if check, okay, I mean, this doesn't do anything. Now the knight has to move, and I'll take the bishop and win the game. Of course, the problem is after knight h7, my rook doesn't have anywhere to move, and I'm going to lose it in exchange for a knight. And they always told me knight's worth 3, rook's worth 5. Not ideal. So, okay, I was like, all right, no more h6. So then the question becomes g6 or f5. These are really the only two ways I can stop a piece from capturing on h7. I wasn't so happy with g6 for similar reasons. This rook looks a little bit awkward here. My opponent is going to try to invade on these dark squares. And furthermore, I've talked about this a lot in my lectures. Whenever you push a pawn in front of your king, it's going to give your opponent a hook. And that is exactly the case here. White is going to be very happy to latch onto this hook, rip open the h-file, and mate my stupid king as punishment for doing this with my pieces on the queen side. Not ideal. So, didn't take long, settled on f5. Now my opponent plays f4 very quickly. Okay, so here we are. In the thick of it here. So, again, what happens if I take on c4? This is still worth thinking about. So, of course, with f4, my opponent is telegraphing what his next idea is. It's to come to h5. Okay, this threatens checkmate. Should probably do something about it. Play h6. Okay, if queen to g6 directly, potentially I could try capturing this. And now after h4, maybe I can capture it and survive the day. But the fact of the matter is, I think there is just h4 directly here, when, again, going to be in a world of hurt. If I take a bishop, for example, this one is not going to be so pleasant, I fear. Let me just do a little sanity check here. No, I'm absolutely insane. Okay, messed that all up. We should take first, and then do all this stuff. Yeah, turns out winning a full bishop, sometimes good. But this threat of queen g6 is still going to be very important to the position. So, bishop takes c4, no good. The threats on the king's side are more urgent. And this line of thinking is how I like to organize my thoughts in a position like this. I look at my threat. My threat is to take on c4. I ask myself how urgent it is. And it's reasonably urgent, right? I win a pawn. I take over a lot of these light squares on the queen's side. Positionally, it improves drastically, but it's not quite as urgent as these mating threats on the king's side. So because the mating threats are more urgent, that's where I need to focus my attention. I need to make sure I'm not getting mated before I take on c4 to continue the game. And this terminology, I'm sort of borrowing from the game of Go. If any of you have played Go, they love talking about urgent threats, right? Your opponent does something, and Go players love saying, that's not urgent at all. My threat is much more urgent. You should have respected my threat. And the same thing kind of happens in chess sometimes. Queen h5, very, very urgent. Bishop takes c4, not quite as urgent. So with that in mind, I calculated for a while, and I found a way to defend. So I would encourage you to try to do the same here. What can you do to stop queen h5? I can list a few ideas for you. One is to go h6 here. One is to go g6 here. One is to go queen e7 here and sort of keep your options open. So go ahead, take a moment, try and figure it out. What I chose, I believe, is potentially the best that I could do. I went with pawn h6, inducing this move queen h5. Now, of course, if I were to capture this, we would get simply f takes, and g6 is coming. Not so good, right? Not so good at all. And so instead, I chose the move queen e7. This is what I had planned. and after now h4, I simply sacrifice the pawn with g6. We get queen takes h6, queen g7, and okay, I've sacrificed a pawn, but I'm winning a pawn over on this side of the board, and my king gets to survive because we traded off the queens. So this was the defense that I came up with. The only one that I think is maybe not so good is this idea of g6. Again, I think this is just a little bit too friendly. It gives white this hook on h5. He's going to go h5, hooking the g6 pawn and getting, some glorious attack. Now, potentially you can survive with knight to g7, but white might play this move anyways. If you get a little bit ambitious here, something like g4 might come, and again, you're just going to get shredded, right? You've put all these pieces on the queen side. You can't allow your opponent to rip things open like this. Now, in the database, queen to e7 has also been played, and I think that this is potentially transposing to a lot of these other lines. Now, queen h5 is no good because of g6, and okay, yes, this still grants white the hook, but we're getting it sort of on our own terms here. We're gaining a full tempo, which makes it a lot more palatable. So instead, something like h4, and then I sort of expect things might start to transpose after something like this. Okay, so queen to e7, potentially even better, because black does have other options after h4. h6 isn't forced, and you do still have the option to go h6 and potentially transpose into the line I played in the game. All that out of the way, I chose h6, queen e7, g6. Notably here, if you take on this square, same thing's going to happen. We're going to trade the queens, and now I get to win another tempo because your knight's attacked. So queen h6 is my opponent's choice. I go queen g7, takes, and now my opponent, to a lesser extent, I think makes the same mistake that my round 3 opponent made. So what happened to my round 3 opponent? He played all the preparation in the world against me, got all the prep that he wanted, and then sort of coasted from there. And once he started coasting, he very quickly made a mistake that in round 3 allowed me to win the game. In this round, I think it allowed me to get back into the fight. Right? I get a lot of activity after my opponent's next move. He chooses to go g4. So g4, I think, is just a little bit too much here. I think white needed to slow down a little bit, focus on getting the rest of his pieces into the game, doing something like castles, doing this odd-looking rook a2 maneuver, just to bring the rook over to the king side as well. Things like this, just to bring the rest of the pieces in before, the fireworks go off with something like g4. After g4, it's true that I have some problems to deal with on the king side, but g4 is basically an attempt to refute my setup entirely. He's saying with g4, your setup is so bad that I can just play g4, I can rip everything open right away, and you should lose, which oftentimes isn't going to be the case in chess. He's overestimating his position, I think, with g4. And now the tactics just get absolutely insane. This game is very, very difficult and very dense. So I actually chose an inaccurate move order here. The position I was trying to achieve is fg4, bishop g6, knight b3, rook b1, knight c1, rook c1, rook takes f4. I wanted to get here. Now, the question before me was, should I take on g4 first, or should I play knight b3 first? And in this case, I actually chose incorrectly. So the better way to play was with fg4. Now, why didn't I go f takes g4? Well, I was afraid that my opponent might potentially not play the move bishop takes g6. I thought they might go rook to b1, stopping my idea of knight to b3, and then after knight to f5, might go something like h5. They might go rook b4, defending this pawn or something, and I thought they could deviate from the line advantageously. So I was afraid of that. Now, the downside to knight b3 first is that after takes, and f takes g4, now here my opponent has an additional option to play rook to f1, defending the pawn on f4, rather than bishop takes g6. And it's going to share some similarities with the other line. I'm still going to be able to go knight to f5, but it turns out the computer says this is just a better version than the other one for white. To my eyes, very difficult to evaluate the difference between these. I think it comes down to deep calculation on the computer's behalf, and I just was not able to discern the difference. No matter, in the game, I played knight b3, rook b1, knight c1, rook c1, fg4, and my opponent did actually capture on g6. And now, once again, I messed up the move order. So I sort of thought, okay, I can go rook takes f4 or bishop takes c4, and I thought they were the same. Why did I think they were the same? I thought that after bishop takes c4, I'm stopping this idea of rook to f1, and I can play rook takes f4 on the next turn. Should be great. And I thought that after rook takes f4, okay, maybe my opponent could try to defend the c4 pawn and stay alive with this kind of move. Bishop back to d3, extracting the bishop, defending the pawn, and I wasn't going to get this activity on this open diagonal. Turns out what I should be more afraid of is after bishop takes c4, white can actually make the king active with king f2 to g3. The king is a fighting piece, and this would have been something not allowed by rook takes f4. Right, the king gets stuck in this box after rook f4, after bishop c4, king f2, here, king g3. King is a fighter. So that was my mistake. But once again, my opponent lets me off the hook, goes knight h7, and we transpose back to the main line. So with some help between me and my opponent, we both messed up our move orders on like every turn in this tactical sequence, but we got to the position that we were supposed to get to anyways. So after this, his idea of knight h7 was to go knight to f6. I go king h8, keeping this f8 square open for my rook. And my opponent now goes rook to g1. Okay, I continue playing naturally. I play this move knight to f5. I need to get this piece in the game. And now my opponent plays h5. Okay, now this is my one and only chance to be significantly better in this game. Up to this point, it's been this wild back and forth with all these tactical ideas. But let's stop for a moment and see what's going on here. How do you assess a position like this, which is, pretty insane, right? Okay, white's pieces kind of suck, meaning the rooks and the king, but my king is not so safe, this pawn is scary, and these pieces are amazing, right? So not so easy to assess, and really what it comes down to is calculation. You look and you say to yourself, what threats can I make in this position, and what threats can my opponent make in this position? It goes back to that kind of sense of urgency. What can I do that my opponent has to respond to, and what can my opponent do that I have to respond to in kind? So for me, the best that I could come up with, what I had planned for this position, is to go knight to h4. I thought that this was the best way to introduce more threats to the position. So what's going on? Well, I thought to myself, okay, if this bishop moves out of the way, okay, obviously I have knight to f3, winning in exchange. If this rook moves out of the way, I'm going to be happy to capture on g6 eventually. Okay, but first actually probably I'm just going to push g3, g2 and try to win the game. And then I think what my opponent had missed is if this rook comes up the board, I can actually win in exchange by force here. And so see if you can calculate this line where black picks up in exchange in this position. Now, while you're calculating that, what I had misunderstood is that the position that arises after I pick up this exchange is actually not so clear at all. In fact, I think it's white with all the winning chances after I win that exchange. So let's see. Hopefully you found the idea. It's rook f1 check, king to d2, knight f3 check. And now if you try to stubbornly connect your king to your rook, you can go king to c2, but this allows knight to, wait a second. This allows rook to f2, forcing this king to one of these awkward squares. If you come to this square, mate in 1. If you come to this square, knight check. If you come to this square, knight b3 check. And finally, we will win in exchange, right? And so that line is great. And that's the only line that I saw at first until I realized white can go king to e3 here. Now after rook takes c1, king takes f3. It's true, I'm up in exchange, and I'm taking a bunch of pawns to boot, but this is absolutely terrifying. King g5 to h6, then this bishop moves, then rook g7, then rook h7. I understand that's a lot of moves, but my challenge to you is, how do you stop that? Because I couldn't figure it out. Just simply could not figure it out. So this is what made me shy away from this line. It's true that wins an exchange, but I think it's actually black who's in trouble. As a side note, I also found this line involving knight to h2 here, and the lines here are just sort of nonsense, and the game would likely end in a perpetual like this. Just pure chaos, though. Pure chaos. So, at the end of the day, I chickened out, and I took on g4, and we got to this endgame, which is a pretty clear draw. And we'll look at that, but first, returning to this position where I played knight h4, my one and only chance to be better was to actually come in with rook to f8. Here, if you get greedy and try something like knight to d7, I think black is just simply winning, following rook e4 check, when if you go here, this is check and mate, and if you go here, this is check, check, and now rook f2, I believe, is threatening check and mate, so you have no time to do things like capture my rook on e4. Just getting shredded with the white pieces. All I needed was that one more attacker involving the rook on f8 to have very good chances to win the game. So it turns out the best that white can do here, there are a few ways to continue. Potentially knight to g4 check, or knight takes g4 is the best you can do. And then here, it just, again, it's just sort of nonsense. Very difficult to evaluate these positions from afar. Like, it's just, it's chaos. It's just chaos. But at the end of the day, I have a lot of pawns. You still have the strong h-pawn, but there's not enough material on the board for me to be as seriously worried about these mating threats that I was concerned with in the other line. So that was my shot. Could have gone rook f8 and, dealt with these complications. I chose knight h4 instead, but after rook takes g4, I think it is in my best interest just to take on g4, and we end up in this simplified endgame. My opponent chooses king f2. Could have opted for knight takes d7, but I think king f2 is a very good choice. If you take on d7, I'm going to come with rook g2. Your king is just going to be a little bit passive. So king f2 first. This pawn isn't really going anywhere. I choose bishop d5, trying to stop rook h1 check and keep pressure on. My opponent just goes rook to g1, takes, now bishop c6, but now knight to e8 is going to pick the pawn back up on c7. Okay, I bring my king over, my opponent goes with c4, I go a6, and here I would potentially be in trouble if I play some dumb move like king f8. Now white has very serious winning chances, but thankfully I'm in time to get to the queen side first with king d8 to c7 to b6 to a5. And then here, I believe here I offered my opponent a draw after king to b6, and he accepted. The game might have continued with king c3, king a5, when I'm just simply going to bring my king to a4, play this move b4, and then we'll trade off these pawns, and it will be a draw. I can't get to the d4 pawn because of this nice little blockade that my opponent has, but my opponent can't really do anything either, thanks to my super active king. So chess is a draw sometimes. So absolutely crazy game in the F3 Nimzo, reaffirming my love of this opening from both sides. It's just a ton of fun getting into these complex positions where it's a real dogfight. So thank you guys for watching. Thanks to my opponent in this round for the super interesting game. In my opinion, potentially the most interesting one of the tournament for me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and as always, I will see you next time.